The Gospel of Matthew, whether in Greek or in Hebrew, without a doubt, is the ultimate example of all the Gospels, all the writings in the New Testament. Matthew was the ultimate reason why the Jews knew that Jesus or Yeshua or Yehoshua could not at all be the Mashiach we were waiting for and still waiting for whatsoever. More than any other gospel, Matthew goes out of its way to push itself onto the Jewish people to prove through the Hebrew Scriptures, through Tanakh, that Jesus or Yeshua or Yehoshua was the Mashiach. Matthew, whoever wrote the book of Matthew, because we don't know, it's Catholic tradition that Matthew wrote Matthew. Christians adopted it, so did Messianics and others. But the fact of the matter is, the manuscripts do not say it was written by Matthew. Who cares? If you believe it, so be it. The bottom line is this, my point. Matthew goes out of its way to say that Jesus or Yeshua fulfilled prophecies from the Hebrew Scriptures. And when you go one by one, check the sources. For example, out of Egypt I've called my son, right? Baby Jesus goes to Egypt. Out of Egypt have I called my son? Well, you look at the reference, you go back, you check Tanakh. Hosea chapter 11 verse 1. What does it say there? Does it say that? No. He chopped it in half. It actually says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. He cut it in half. It's not speaking about the Messiah, it's speaking about Israel, the Exodus. Rachel weeping for her children, meaning in the Hebrew Scriptures, Matthew misuses Jeremiah to say that Rachel was weeping for babies that were going to die 700 years later, and she was weeping for her children, for they were no more. But what happens? Again, in context, you read, he did quote it correctly. It was the one time he actually quoted something correctly. The next verse, God tells Rachel, stop your weeping, for your children will come back to you. Stop crying. Over and over and over, Matthew misuses the text to persuade that something in the Hebrew Scriptures proves that everything that Jesus did in Matthew fulfilled prophecy. We look at, he will be called a Nazarene. Where does it say this? Nobody knows. If you look from today till next year, there is no such verse at all. And some study Bibles, believe it or not, will point you to the story of Samson. Yes, you heard me right. The story of Samson. He will be called a Nazarite. He will be a Nazarite. You will not lay hands on his hair to cut his hair. It's nowhere. It's a made-up prophecy, completely fabricated. On and on and on. If you look at all the so-called prophecies that he fulfilled, they're all bunk. They're all made up. It's fake prophecies. He didn't fulfill anything. He did the opposite. The Mashiach, the time of God's kingdom, there's supposed to be a time of peace, coming together of families. Matthew says, I did not come to bring peace. I came to bring war, to turn families against each other's, households against each other's, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers. The opposite. He speaks about the destruction of the temple. The prophecies in the Hebrew Scripture says, no, the temple is to be rebuilt. Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 24 to the very end, very clearly defines that when the Mashiach comes, the temple will be rebuilt forevermore. Every single thing that Matthew claims is bunk. It's not even real. Completely fabricated, misquoting of the text, making up verses, completely fabricated. Second, the book of Matthew paints the picture, a false picture of the reality of Israel during Roman occupation at that time. Again, people that don't study history of the ancient Israelites at that time will believe that the book of Matthew is accurate in the depiction, and it's not. The Roman occupation was a cruel occupation. They crucified over 100,000 Jews before and after Jesus or Yeshua came. Over 100,000 were crucified. It says in historical sources that there were so many people crucified, Jews, that they actually ran out of lumber. They had to order more lumber from Lebanon. And you didn't get crucified for double parking your camel. You were crucified for being an insurrectionist, a rebellious person, or claiming to be the Messiah. We have documented records of people claiming to be the Messiah before and after. They were all killed. They were all slaughtered. So the Gospel of Matthew paints this picture that the world in Israel was such a beautiful place, and Israel was such a wonderful location. The Romans, there was no big deal with the Romans. The only problem was those miserable rabbis, the rascally rabbis. That was the only issue. The Romans swept away. Pontius Pilate, he was a Pop-Tart. Pontius Pilate didn't see anything. I don't see anything wrong with him. He washed his hands. I don't want anything to do with it. We know from historical sources that Pontius Pilate was a maniac. He was the Saddam Hussein of the ancient world, of Rome. He was so violent in historical sources that he was removed out of Israel. This is reality, not the book of Matthew. He was removed by Rome. Do you know how evil you have to be if the Romans think you're evil and you're removed? And not only that, he was later removed out of Rome. The book of Matthew tries very hard. It was obviously written to convince Jews that Jesus or Yeshua was the Mashiach, but failed more than any other gospel. Matthew showed the Jewish people, serious religious Jews, that Jesus or Yeshua could not at all be the Mashiach whatsoever, because he fulfilled none of the real prophecies of the Messianic age. For example, the ingathering of the Jewish exiles. We see this all over the place in Deuteronomy chapter 30 verse 3, Isaiah chapter 11 verses 11 through 12, Isaiah chapter 43 verses 5 and 6, Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 18, and numerous other places. The rebuilding of the Holy Temple. In the book of Matthew, he foretells the destruction of the temple. He brings destruction to the temple, according to Matthew. That's the opposite of what it says about the rebuilding of the temple. We see in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 24 to the end, that when the Mashiach comes, there will be a rebuilding of the temple. And when that temple is rebuilt, then the nations will know that God glorifies Israel when the temple is among them forevermore. So it's the opposite. We see the rebuilding of the temple in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, Isaiah chapter 60, verse 7, Isaiah chapter 56, verses 6 through 7, Malachi chapter 3, verse 4, Zechariah chapter 14, verses 20 through 21, just to name a few sources. Observance of the Torah, a worldwide observance of the Torah. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 8 and verse 10. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 32, universal observance of the Torah. This never happened. Ezekiel chapter 11, verses 19 through 20, just to name a few. A reign of peace, earth-wide peace, never happened. In fact, the Jewish people were exiled after Jesus died. The opposite. We see this in Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 4 about the reign of peace. Hosea chapter 2, verse 20. Isaiah chapter 32, verses 16 through 18, just to name a few. There are many more. Universal knowledge of God, worldwide knowledge of God, knowing God, the God of Abraham. That did not happen 2,000 years ago and since. Zechariah chapter 8 verse 23 speaks about this. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 9, which says, "And Yahweh shall be king over all the earth. On that day Yahweh will be one, and his name shall be one." Isaiah chapter 66 verse 23, Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9, and on and on. The Davidic king, which is the actual real Messiah, the real Mashiach to come. It's spoken about in Isaiah chapter 11 verses 1 through 10. Read it for yourselves. Jeremiah chapter 23 verses 5 and 6. Jeremiah chapter 30 verses 7 through 10. And Jeremiah chapter 33 verses 14 through 17. Ezekiel chapter 34 verses 23 through 30. Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 24 through 28, just to name a few. The fact of the matter is, nothing that was supposed to be fulfilled was fulfilled. And everything that Matthew claims were fulfillments were complete fabrications, fake prophecies, stuff that you cannot prove, you can only believe in. So there are many reasons. These are just a handful of examples why the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, by itself is a false document, whether in Hebrew or not. The fact of the matter is, it goes out of its way to literally show for itself that it is a false document and blasphemy against the God of Israel, because it misinterprets and misuses the holy text of the Hebrew Bible to make its claims, which fall on deaf ears for those of us who know the Scripture well and study. We are not fooled by these fake prophecies, and that's why we do not accept the Gospel of Matthew, because it completely disrespects the Hebrew Scriptures, and we want nothing to do with it because it is not holy. Shalom.